Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session of the Climate Collective. And today we're joined by Tabita, Rezaire, and Josephine, Budge in discussion with myself and Susan. And today we're really having a discussion about, I suppose, what it means to be human in and after and in alternative to the Anthropocene. And we will be kind of, I suppose, speaking from the position and informed by both Ama and Tabita's work. I'll leave it up to maybe both of you to introduce yourselves. But to start us off, I'm going to read briefly, I think it's helpful, from the text is the Anthropocene racial capitalism by Françoise Rezaire. Just to kind of give us a bit of a focus, but I'm going to have to find my spot. So she states, I can't find it now. She speaks to the fact that so much research has been done and so much writing has focused on the problematic of who is affected by climate change and dangerous and damaging extractive practices. And she asked the question, is the Anthropocene racial? Scholars have studied race as a central element of destructive environmental policies, but what connection can be made between the Western conception of nature as cheap and the global organization of a cheap, racialized, disposable workforce, given the conception of nature as a constant capital, and the fact that organizers of the capitalist world system appropriated Black labor power as constant capital. And I think what's vital about this question, but also about the work of you, Tabita, and you, Ama, is the question of, well, if so many people, and Black people in particular, have this kind of historical background of being posited in the same place as nature within this racial capitalist scene. There are, of course, histories and strategies of resistance, of cosmology, of imagination that have reimagined what it means to be human outside of the focus of the racial capitalist scene. And I think both of you really explore some of these kinds of ideas and have leaned on both historical and sort of indigenous traditional cosmologies, as well as thinkers and healers to inform the way both of you are thinking about this question. And that's really what I'm hoping we can discuss today. So I will hand over to you, maybe Tabita, to start off introducing yourself.
Hello, everybody, and you, with three. What I can say is that I am a work in progress very much at the moment. Yes, I think that would be the best description of who I am. I don't really know. I'm trying to find out, and yeah, maybe that's it. I'm a seeker, really. You know, that's literally like what I am, I think. And yeah, I'm seeking for the source of existence. I say this so nonchalantly. Yes, I'm just seeking for the source of existence. But basically that's it, you know. I think that's everything behind my work, behind my life, between everything that I do is striving for this. And yeah, that's me.
That's great, thank you. And Emma, handing over to you.
You've set a high bar here, Tabita, because I'm used to just being like, yeah, here's my bio, I do this stuff. And now I'm like, no, fundamentally, who am I? Well, I think if you're a seeker, then I would say I am a speculator across my practice. I really center the idea of speculating possibilities, speculating futures, speculating Blackness, speculating on aesthetics and politics and pleasure and care. and how to navigate institutional spaces as a Black queer artist and woman and human. And that kind of exists in different ecosystems. I have a kind of research hat. I'm doing a PhD at Birkbeck, and I'm also an artist, a kind of installation, originally performance artist. Now I do mostly textual and installation based work, and recently mixed media. I've just made my first art film, has just gone live last week, which is very exciting and terrifying. And I think in this space of speculating across my practice is fighting for the right to speculate, fighting to return again and again to who is allowed to speculate, to the ways that I have been conditioned not to speculate, or to police the possibilities that may be ephemeral but possible but real. To kind of use speculating to counter gaslighting and white supremacy and exhaustion and depression, despair. And I wanted to say something else about speculating, but I have this new COVID brain that I'm living with after having COVID, where thoughts just go away. So I'm trying to just be really vocal about that, being like, COVID took that thought. So maybe it will come back at some point. But I think I'm going to stick with the speculating as a fundamental trait of who I am.
That's great. That's great. So as a first question, and I think I present this to you, I wanted us to start with the end, which is kind of this fact that both of you have sort of played the idea of the apocalypse, which I suppose is this option to think about emerging out of it with something else, and kind of thinking through all of the knowledges we might have to help us through that process. I don't know, maybe Amma, we could start with you. If you could tell us a little bit about your project, Apocalypse Reading Room, or any other work that you think sort of fits to this, and maybe start to sort of speak to forms of humanness that emerge out of what the Apocalypse Reading Room means for you.
Yeah, I've worked somewhat inadvertently with the notion of apocalypse for a really long time, but I think, it's important to define maybe apocalypse a little bit through a decolonial lens, because I think it's important to resituate apocalypse as always happening around us, and that we are living in the aftermath of many apocalypses, that peoples and species are, and knowledges and lots of kind of forms of ways of being and ways of living are being snuffed out of existence all the time, both violently and less violently. So I think working with apocalypse across my creative practice has been a way of reckoning with the world that we're living in now, but also all the worlds that have passed. That's what I was going to say about speculating. That it's a way of reckoning with the histories that have been stolen from us or made invisible. And so I was going to say that speculating is, for me, is kind of an antidote to the archives that are not tangible, that are not tangibly accessible to us, but that we know existed because they had to exist, because if they didn't exist, we wouldn't be here. It doesn't make sense. So I think for me, apocalypse is a way of flipping the script on Western ideas of linear time, because I'm thinking through the past and thinking through the future at the same time, thinking through apocalypses that my ancestors have survived in order for me to still be here, and therefore what are the kind of ingrained knowledges for surviving apocalypse that I have in my body for the apocalypses that will continue to come and are coming really, really fast all around us. And then also I think I have a bit of a romanticized idea of apocalypse a little bit. I want to kind of be really transparent about that. So this project, the virtual room that I am in, is my installation that recently closed at Arts Admin Toynbee Studios in East London, called the Apocalypse Reading Room. This is the second iteration of it. The first one happened at Free Word in 2019, and it's kind of what it sounds like on the tin. It's a apocalyptic library, artist library, filled with, the kind of tagline is, all the books that we might need to save the end of the world. But of course, it's only like a tiny percentage of the books that we might need to save the end of the world. And there is really, it's a kind of flippant statement, because I don't really believe in the end of the world anyway. But it's this idea of, I suppose, thinking abundantly that we have everything that we need to shift things, and that it's not always about searching for the new knowledge, or we need something else, we need more people, we need more PhDs, we need more books to be written. Now, maybe we have all the knowledge, so then why aren't we kind of absorbing that knowledge or using that knowledge, or how do we kind of absorb it into our beings? And so for the Apocalypse Reading Room was a space where I invited everybody, but especially QTBPOC artists, to rest, reflect, read. And it came out of this idea that I had, that one day, pre-pandemic, I had this certainty that one day I was going to be stuck in my house and I wouldn't be able to get out. And there would be no internet and no anything. And it was going to be, you know, like London would be flooding, and I would just only have what I had in my house. So I've been hoarding books, like DIY books, as well as like philosophical books and Octavia Butler, for like years, and books on plant medicine and native weeds to England that thrive in damp areas, because I was like, everywhere's going to be like a bog. So like, you know, what can I like use to heal my wounds in a bog? So I've been hoarding these books for years. And I was like, but I never get to read them, because capitalism absorbs all so many facets of my being. So it was about, the project was about slowing down. And I suppose, yeah, a somewhat romanticized view that when capitalism is no longer able to function, there might be time to start living some of the seeds that we're planting, some of the ways of being that we remember in our bodies. And of course, lots of people are doing that right now, right? Whether they are leaving cities or they never lived in cities, and they are living in that way. But I think for me, it was about being able to do that without feeling like you were checking out from that particular front line. So I think, yeah, the idea of apocalypse is something that I'm returning to, is something that I consider to be non-temporally linear. I don't consider it to be in the future. I slightly romanticize it, and I think it's a bit of a relief for me to work with apocalypses, because I live in some ways, being both depressive and having somewhat severe anxiety, in a constant state of panic, you know, and being a sci-fi writer in Rezaire, that, you know, we are about to be flooded at all times, or, you know, collapsed or whatever. And so it's quite reassuring for me to it's like the opposite of gaslighting myself, to be like, yeah, we are in the apocalypse. And then it's like, oh, okay, great, like, thanks for just acknowledging that, now let's get some shit done.
That's great, thanks, Emma. And I think with Susan and the rest of the climate team, we've certainly been kind of working through this idea that part of what climate emergence rather than emergency means is this kind of recognition that the emergency has been going on a long time, and that there are, of course, these many knowledges that we can rely on. But I think your idea that an apocalypse might be time for reading is a helpful one to think through. Handing over to you, Tabita, your work, and I might pronounce it wrong, Orbit Diapason, something like this, also sort of plays with these ideas, but you've also worked with, I think, these kinds of thematics for some time. Maybe you could tell us kind of how you're thinking about the end, or the multiple ends, and kind of what that's meant for you in your work.
Yes, I can try. I don't have much idea about the apocalypse, to be honest. Yeah, I don't know. but I like thresholds, or I'm called to attend to, grow through, learn from. Those spaces like birth and death, you know, are like times that I feel very intimate with, you know, and I think my work also as a doula, you know, plays into it. But beyond like biological, like birth and death, also I think I've always been, yes, called to look at realms where we this motion, or the death of a plant, or the birth of an ideology, of an idea, of a trauma, like what do we do? How do we shift energy, literally, you know, within ourselves, within the things that we want to grow? How do we birth? How do we die? You know, how do we let go of things, of all of it? So maybe that's a maybe more intimate, you know, a way to think through the apocalypse. You know, there's no like grand thing within, you know, my relationship with it. Then in the work that you're mentioning, yes, more like a play, you know, like a kind of yes, because basically the work is about alien or alienhood, and what does it, how we have engaged with extraterrestrial beings, you know, through our culture historically, but then in like pop culture, in cosmology, in science, in spirituality, and in, well, different spheres of existence, you know. And in pop culture, aliens always come as like, oh, it's the end of the world, you know, like aliens are gonna come and they're gonna kill everybody, or they're gonna, you know, the earth's gonna disappear. So it's always an apocalyptic kind of vibe. And I don't know, that's interesting to me because cosmologically there's always been, especially in some like African cosmologies, you know, aliens, or even in Indian philosophies, extraterrestrial beings are part of the birth of the earth, you know, or even of the human. So we have possibly even a lineage with some beings from a different planets. So it's very much more fertile as an encounter. And so maybe it's like this fear that exists, that an encounter with like otherness has to be apocalyptic. And I think that's what we're also in many ways like replaying throughout history, you know, and still now with maybe other beings like the earth, the land, like it's always like a violent, extractive, like apocalyptic relationship, but it could also be a tending to, you know. Yeah, so something like this. Then I guess now I'm studying farming, and I'm very into beekeeping. So I guess there's a whole like thing, you know, with the apocalypse and bees. The bees are dying. So I'm not trying to mean that it's not the case, but I think it's a little bit more complex, you know, because I don't know if I should get into it, but I'll try in like two minutes. So this whole thing of like we need to save the bee is like it's a certain species of bee that people are trying to save, and that's the European bee. It's quite interesting actually, because for instance in French Guiana where I am, those bees have been introduced with slavery and, you know, colonialism. And actually why? Not even for honey, because the European, they wanted more candles for their churches, so they needed more bees. I love that story. But there's many indigenous bees, you know, and they are basically being threatened by the import, you know, the constant import of like European bees, and even like worldwide, that's the thing. Native bees are being, are disappearing, you know. So like it's interesting how like globally we can have that understanding that we're saving the bee, but by saving one species, like you threaten many others, you know? And so that's another thing that's playing out in different ways, you know, now in the bee, but in many ways within our human like communities, you know? So yeah, those things interest me somehow.
Thank you, Tabita. Thank you very much for sharing that. Susan, I don't know if you have any initial sort of thoughts or questions. Otherwise, I can continue to sort of jump onto another thought.
Well, actually, thanks, Malema, and thank you, Amma and Tabita. I thought it would be actually really interesting to hear a little bit more about your practices, because they are very multi-temporal, multi-scalar. There isn't a practice. There's a proliferation of practices, some of which we would understand to be creative, poetic, artistic, but others that are, you know, community organizing, pedagogical, and about relearning or unlearning, etc. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear from both of you a little bit more about the ways in which you go about developing a kind of practice that's highly distributed and operates in sort of multiple registers, perhaps I'm guessing as a response to a set of specific conditions that you might encounter that demand that your practice is in some way reconfigured or reformulated at that. So I think part of the discussions that we have been trying to have in the collective is to look at different practices, different modes of knowledge production, and the different kinds of interventions, the ways in which a practice can be both responsive to a condition and a situation, sometimes reactive, but also like prospective, as in reimagining a different scenario oriented towards the future, how a practice could be speculative. So maybe a few words on just each of you, how you've really developed your practice and the necessity for this kind of very, like in my understanding, quite a distributed notion of practice, that at certain moments we need to respond in very particular ways, and it sort of makes a demand on us to develop new forms of practice, I would say, and new allies between different kinds of practices and practitioners. Yeah. Amma, do you want to begin maybe? Or?
Yeah, I was actually going to see if Tabita, you wanted to begin, because I want to gather my thoughts a little bit in response to that beautiful question.
Okay. Yeah, I think for me it's a little different. I mean, because you said, I mean, from what I understand from your question, is that maybe the practices shift as a response to a situation or ecology, or, you know, a world happening in a way. No?
So, yes, that's one kind of practice that is sort of responding to, but
Right.
there's the other practices that are maybe not just responding, but are actually perhaps
yes, I got it. Yes,
you have a different orientation, or are tuning into a past and reformulating. So yeah, I think just
so I think for me it's an inner vibe, an inner ecology, I can say, response. So a lot of my work, I mean, I guess my practices in general really is a space to share whatever I experience in my life, or like my journey in a way, like literally need to share my journey, like emotionally, politically, spiritually. And as I grow within myself and the things that, you know, the turmoils that manifest themselves and need to be responded to, like different tools maybe, or different research are calling, you know. And so then I'm drawn to different spheres of knowledge or experience, and then that's going to feed into my practice. And so then my practice shifts. So yeah, I don't know if you want more detail, but I think that's the mechanism of the, I don't know if the word you say was diverse, or no, you said that.
Maybe to speak to this question, Tabita, you could tell us a bit shortly about
right, yes, but okay, maybe with Amakaba it's a little different, because this is a little, I mean, I don't know if it's inside or outside of me, but it's very much it feels like something I had to do instead of something I necessarily wanted to do, you know. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and I'm still trying to find peace with it. And I think many of us, you know, are there, you know, trying to answer the calls of the ancestors, really, you know, wanting us to show up for the healing that we need to do, you know. And it's always like this in everybody's lineage, you know, like trauma or pains and gifts are passed down until they are claimed, until they're accepted, responded to for the gift, and then the trauma until somebody stand up and say, okay, I'm gonna hold space for it and digest the part I can. So then I, you know, I live a little less or a little more, who knows, depending, you know, on anybody. So I think I'm in a space maybe where I answered, or I'm trying to, because I've been hearing, and I've been like, no, leave me alone, I'm not gonna do this until I'm here in the middle of the forest. I'm like, what am I doing? How am I gonna do this? You know, but it's okay because I know I'm guiding and I know that's what I need to do, even if it's terrifying, you know. So that's the real answer. But then I can speak about it in different ways. There is maybe a social, ecological, but really it's not really this, you know. So it's related, I guess, you know, because it's related. So that's for me. I can talk about it a little more, but Amma, maybe you want to say something.
Yeah, thank you. That was so rich. That was really helpful as well. When you first asked this question, I thought about, well, this idea of a speculative practice and working in ways that we might go on to be working, for me, is ways in which those disciplines don't exist, right? Because we're all like interdisciplinary practitioners now, which is just kind of a bullshit because, you know, the disciplinary boundaries are so violent and they're so economically driven by class and privilege. And I mean, why do I do all the things that I do? Because when I began professionally working, I dropped out of uni and I came back to London and there was no work. Post 2008 crisis, there was no work. And so we did anything and everything that we could do, as well as working bar jobs. You know, I learned how to build websites and I learned how to do comms and tweet and whatever else I had to do to try and stay somehow connected to the arts and pay my rent. But then also, why do I do all these different things that I do? Because I find singular disciplines, for me, I mean, I'm also very envious of people who have us like, who just have been playing the violin since they were 6 and they're like, this is what they do. I'm always like, wow, mega imposter syndrome. But for me, I also need a lot of stimulation. And I get very, and then the other thing that I wrote down was that I get heartbroken. So when I about 5 years ago, I got what I was like a dream job as like a guest curator in an arts organization that was working on women and climate and art. And I was like, oh my God, like I've been working towards this and grinding and like, yes. And then it was like awful. It was like so racist and so tokenizing and just like absolutely destroying. I mean, I just was like, more than it being shit, it was like, oh fuck, what do I do now? Sorry, I haven't even asked if I can swear all over this conversation, but anything after 5 p.m. I think swearing needs to be allowed. And so, you know, these kind of multiple heartbreaks of like, I thought it was going to be something else. I thought it was going to feel better or like less awful and less personal and less shattering, and then it doesn't, and then you like break down, because then what are we doing? Why have I been doing all this and killing myself? And okay, and now I have to rebuild, and I have to rebuild myself, because now I want to do something a little bit different, because the thing that I thought I wanted to do broke me a little bit, and now I need to reshape that. So I think it's a huge process of like, I'm thinking about I can't remember what it I don't want to get it wrong, but I think it's the Japanese art of mending, where they when pots are broken, they fill them together with liquid gold. And I'm thinking about like how this interdisciplinary practice is really a series of kind of the ways that we've attempted to mend ourselves with a care for beauty, with a desperation to have something that remains light, that remain or can contain light and water and beauty, because there's so much that is broken, that is brutal. So I think there's something there about that. I also wrote down, like, as I get older, having more permission to do things I'm not trained to do, right? So I've just made this art film, and I was like, I can't make an art film. I'm not a visual artist, but I'm making installation work, and I've made this film, and thousands of people have watched it apparently, you know, and it's like, wow. And it's really scary and exciting. And so I think there's that kind of shift of giving oneself more permission to do things that, you know, you're told that you maybe can't do, and just doing them anyway, and then doing things to try and be useful. So I'm getting towards the answering the call, I think, searching desperately to be useful, and thinking, oh, I'm going to be useful if I'm a part of Black Lives Matter and I organize protests. And then again, it's heartbreaking and it's not what you thought it was going to be, or you're not actually really, really great at it. And you're like, oh, I need to find a different way. And yesterday I was running I run these science fiction writing classes called Science Fiction as Activism workshops. And I was running one up in Chester in Northern England. And of course it's COP up in Glasgow. So everybody on the train to Chester was also going to COP. And there were all these announcements saying, if you're going to COP on the train, then you need to be aware of this and this, and Glasgow's full of police. And so I was talking to the group, and I was like, what does it mean that we're here writing science fiction and we're calling this activism when all of us could be at COP? You know, I mean, not at COP, but outside COP, protesting COP, right? So these kinds of I don't want to use the word rebranding, but I suppose reclaiming of what we do and what we call it and who it's for and how it's useful and how it feeds us and how it allows us to go on without just being completely battered down by everything. And then and finding more things that I love, like teaching. And then of course this fundamental question, which I only really was able to articulate, I think, in the last 18 months, which is answering the call of the ancestors. So I'm really happy that I went second, because when you said that, I was like, yes, of course. You know, I'm not an interdisciplinary practitioner. I'm trying to answer the call of the ancestors without messing it up, right? Because for me, that call is like, I feel so much pressure, and it can be very petrifying, not just in terms of the fear, but in terms of actually being fixed in place, because there's so much to do all the time. And I think I think a lot of us feel very aware that we are the future ancestors, and who are we the future ancestors of? You know, and that we have not just a responsibility, but a kind of like deeply on a level of kind of atoms and microbial makeup, some kind of really compelling connection to them in this particular moment. And I walk with that. I think I feel that I walk with those ancestors and the descendants and the future ancestor that I will be, and I feel like very accountable, and it's a lot to measure up to. And there's a lot of kind of, okay, let me just get through today, you know, and then I'll come back to, you know, the legacy of all people who lived through 2020. Yeah.
You know, thank you both for those really wonderful responses, and maybe just to stay with your last point for a moment, Amma, which is firstly, I wanted to mention one of our previous guests was Amani Jacqueline Brown, who's someone who studied in the center with us, but then so she came to the UK from Louisiana, from New Orleans, and she was talking about metabolic processes at one point, and that it would take approximately 7 years for the cells that to regenerate themselves that were a consequence of living in this incredibly polluted environment, which is called Cancer Alley, because of the sort of oil and gas operations in Louisiana, but also which have, of course, completely devastated local, certainly Black communities, present and past. And there was there's many plantations in that part of Louisiana that are now basically the sites of extractivism. And so Amani was saying that literally, that is to say materially, it would take this process of at least 7 years for her body to slough off that history of that sort of embodied history of toxicity from where she came. And so I guess I was just really interested in a couple of things you said at the very end, in particular about answering the call of ancestors. And so that suggests a certain kind of way of attunement or listening, like that call is how is it that you're actually hearing that call, and maybe it's not actually operating according to the register of the acoustic, because then you're suggesting that it's more metabolic, more sort of cellular, if you will. So I'm really curious about that, like answering the call suggests that there's a mode of perception that you might be engaging in, and I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about that. If it's listening, if it's an attunement, if it is a sort of sensory or perceptible kind of like, how is that sort of call of the ancestors making itself sort of felt, I suppose, or registering for you?
What? Shall I?
It's up to you, but I guess
Sorry. Yeah, anyway, that was just my sorry.
No, sure.
No,
But
I
I
mean,
think
no, go. Sorry, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
I think it depends very on each individual, you know, and also in their cultures, you know, because there's traditions of how that calling can be interpreted, how it emerged depending on your cultures, because your ancestors have different ways culturally of making themselves visible or known or channeled, or it's as much as it's a lineage, a genealogy of relatedness, of parenthood, it's also a lineage of knowledge. So yes, I can answer for myself, you know, and maybe some places I've been or things I may know, but it's I think it's very specific, you know, like in some cultures, like there's still processes of initiation. So if there's certain signs, like the family will know that child needs to be initiated because the ancestors are asking this, you know, and often different, again, it's a cultural thing. You may have like a healer. Each family has a healer that they go to, and you have to do like ceremony rituals, and in those rituals the ancestors come and they speak and they say, okay, you need to do this and this, or this child needs that, or that, and then you do rituals to tend to the needs of the ancestors, because as much as we have needs, the ancestors also, you know, sometimes they need to be fed, sometimes they need this, or all sorts of things. So I think it really depends. Then there's also like, how am I going to say? Stories, or, I mean, often, okay, let me say, sometimes people say if you don't answer the call, you know, if you're not sensitive or you don't perceive, or maybe your family is out of that institutionalized relationship with their ancestors, then they'll find a way, you know, to make you shift past. But often it might be a depression, you know, often illness might be a sign that the ancestors want something, you know, or it can be, some people are intuitive, you know, they can hear things, they can see, or they, you know, channel, but some don't, you know, or not yet. And then life is going to knock them out, you know. Once, they don't listen, twice, they don't listen 3 times. And they're like, oh, okay, maybe something needs to change. Yeah, so it depends. But they find their way out, always. They're creative. So, yeah. But then if you don't, it's okay. And then it's going to be passed down. Then your descendants will have that opportunity again, you know, until someone stands up for the lineage, you know?
Yeah, I think I was thinking this is an impossible question to answer, particularly in English, which again is just so compartmentalized. Like, to renegade this to the cellular somehow disregards the spiritual or all the other senses somehow, because suddenly we're in a cellular realm, but it also is cellular, right? And it renegades it to sorry about the fireworks if you can hear them, it renegades it to the realm of the human also, as though we exclusively experience some kind of call because we are these superior sentient beings that other things don't experience. So I think within my cosmology, which is very pieced together, really, it's a very creolized cosmology. I think there is really returns actually also to Malema's original question about where we're positioning or thinking through humanness. There is a real like humility that is needed to just get off the high horse of the human a little bit and think, okay, well, some of us have forgotten how to hear that call, which is really just a way of being where you give a shit about more than yourself. For me, really, that's what the call is. That's it. It's super simple. It's just like, oh, I'm connected to other things. How I behave impacts other things in more than my lifetime. It's really like, that's it for me. And there are more complex ways to interpret that and deeper ways to go, but the nut and bolts of it are the way I behave, the way I am, the gases and chemicals my body emits, the energies and vibrations my actions precipitate affects things around me, and in temporal lineages that I can't even fathom, right? Like humans only have one kind of temporal lineage spanning up to, let's say, 120 years, right? Which is just a minutiae flick of a switch in terms of all the other kinds of temporal ecologies all around us that are hundreds and hundreds of years, or thousands and thousands of years, or millions and millions of years. And so the idea that we can measure what this like cellular core might be, it's really crazy for me and is really arrogant, I think. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't like try to articulate what these attunements are, or these senses are, or where they're living. But there is for me a necessity to have a humility of scale, that there are only certain ways that we might be able to know. And that's fine. That's great. That's okay. How wonderful, how awful to know and understand everything. Why is that the goal? I don't understand. So I think it's about, returning to, learning from and returning to ways of hearing that plants are doing all around us, right? That forest groves are doing. They're tuning in and saying, okay, we have too much alkaline soil in this part, and there's too many borer beetles in this section, and we need to manufacture something else over here, and this isn't getting enough sunlight, and this is proving, too invasive, and this is just kind of like censoring self-regulation, but an understanding that how we regulate our ecology now affects what can exist in this grove in 200, 300, 400, 500 years, and that this grove exists because of that previous lineage of tapping in. And I think, what like in the West we call mental health is a way of being attuned, is a way of tapping in and going, something feels really, really wrong, and I don't know what to do about it, and it's so much bigger than me, and I can't cope to different like extents and with different manifestations, and not having and like a GP for all the amazingness the NHS is, just being such an inadequate point of call for that kind of tapping in. And I love, like, there's an essay by Chelsea M. Fraser that I love called Troubling Ecologies, where she's talking about Parable of the Sower, and Lauren, the main character, encountering these wild dogs, and even though dogs are very dangerous in this kind of post-apocalyptic California scenario, rather than like try and attack the dog or run from the dog, she kind of hides and watches the dog, and watches how the dog is positioning its body in relation to the landscape, and scenting the air and noting where the wind is coming from. And there's this kind of really beautiful way that Fraser's analysis is holding together this question that you brought up at the beginning, Malema, around this hypernaturalization, right, of racialized, particularly Black bodies. So she's holding together this almost animalization process that the character is going through, but it's an empowered process, right? She's learning about survival. She's learning about herself as an animal in the context of a wider ecology in crisis. And it's somehow not through this white gaze of, oh, look at the amazing Black girl. She's able to, adapt to this rabid landscape because, of her, like, whatever, magical Negro genes. And it's somehow not that. And I think, I taught a whole course earlier this year on this question of human to non-human allyship, and how previously and still dehumanized people stand in allyship with more than human life, to think of without being further dehumanized, legally as well as politically, socially, in terms of how we are read. I think it's about understanding that the non-human is not a static state of being, right? It's not definable. So to say we are hypernatural doesn't make any sense, right? Because what does that mean? And if there is an idea of a living, transforming, much bigger than we can imagine consciousness or consciousnesses, then they can also stand in allyship with us. And somehow shifting the way that we're like thinking in terms of sentience and consciousness and intention drastically shifts those power dynamics and kind of explodes them outside of this, for me, white supremacist, post-enlightenment, neo-colonial way of viewing human, non-human, racialized, non-racialized, natural, non-natural. Because it's just one very narrow lens for understanding the world. And through that lens, we don't have these registers, or we don't have the language. Of course we still have them, but we don't have the languages for understanding what we are sensing when we're hearing these calls and feeling these tremors of things being wrong. Sorry, that was a very long answer, I apologize.
Great, it's really great. And it's got me thinking a little bit about, I suppose, thinking around futures. And I mean, we've already started with the apocalypse as a kind of positive feature in a way, in both of the way you're thinking or outside of the kind of normal frames of it. But I'm thinking also of the ways in which these kinds of multiplicities and kind of manifold ways that both of you are working might also be applied as tools to future thinking and maybe to speculative thinking, in your case, Amma. So for example, Tabita, I'm thinking of the work that you've done around technologies and the kinds of lines and linkages, for example, to slavery that our current internet holds, and these deeply troubling origins and applications of technology and the internet. And of course, in the space of kind of climate change, there are increasingly these sort of techno-fix ideas of, I don't know, giant umbrellas or carbon capture systems that kind of really mess with a kind of hubris that can be somewhat terrifying. And a lot of what your work has looked to do is to kind of think otherwise about how we might work with technology and the internet and what it might serve. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit to some of that work, which I know you're kind of working in multiple kinds of ways, but has been so much a part of your work for many years. And maybe how we might use some of the kind of cosmologies and sort of intersectional thinking that you work with to respond to these really problematic strategies of technology and the environment in the world. Long question.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I don't know. And my view of technology is broader, I think, than what many consider as technology. And I think it's okay, the internet is one, but if we talk of information and communication technology, then yes, ancestor communication is a technology. Our relationship to water can be a technology. Our relationship with plants can be a technology because there's information shared all the time, whether we are conscious of it or not. And most of the time we're not, and many people will never be maybe conscious, that plants speaks, and water sings and the forest like chant all the time. But it's about, I think, broadening the scope of our knowledge centers and of first within the world, also within ourselves, because we're so like brain oriented, like think like knowledge is in books and okay, I need to know, like information is always like outsourced, but there's so much information that we have access to, you know, from within ourselves, really, you know, if we open to that database, and it can be as wide and as we are. But the thing is, we understand ourselves as so narrow, you know, we're just this piece of flesh, you know, this piece of food, of body, of earth. And then, of course, the information we have access from there is very limited. But if we go our being into understanding, like, okay, I'm this body, but I'm also all the ancestors that came before me, and I'm also all the elements that maintain my body. So I'm water, I'm earth, I'm fire, I'm the air that I breathe. No, I'm also the land that I walked upon. I'm also like the sun that gives energy to the planet, and I'm the moon who allows like those like cycle to move the tides, and my inner tides and my menstrual cycle. So if I become all of this, like all of what those entities or bodies know, I can know, you know? So I think that's the fundamental technology that that we are or have access to. If we, I don't know, like plug, maybe, yeah, we're not plugged to Wi-Fi, to the inner Wi-Fi, or I don't know, or maybe to power. Yes, because we're tired, we're exhausted, and it's, we don't have that range, you know, of bandwidth. You know, we live in this, you know, we live like this, we're afraid, we're terrified, we're anxious, we're all of it, you know. And so that is, you know, making us small. It's like the whole world is wanting us to be small, you know. And not that we have to be big and arrogant, but you can be wide and so humble, because you're intimate with life, just with the processes of life, because you understand that you're a piece of life, like any tree, any plant, any insect. And I think it's a process, you know, of building that that intimacy and that connection. And that's what technology is for. Or at least information and communication technologies, like tools to build connection. So depending what you want to connect to, how you want to connect, from where, then it's going to build different technologies, and you're going to seek different technologies. So the internet can respond to some of those needs, but not all. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you hearing you speak about it, it sounds like something that should be doable. And yet we do think from a very kind of narrow positionality, no? And that narrow positionality comes from many hundreds of years of a very particular kind of way of thinking that has kind of gotten us to the point that we're in, and has resulted in the damage we're living with now. And I suppose the question becomes how we break that open, and are able to draw from a much more expansive framework. I don't know, Amma, if you have some thoughts, particularly in some of the writing work that you've done. I'm thinking of Ashola Fishes, for example. Fish?
Lovers.
Thank you. Yeah, thinking through sort of imagining new futures, and the kinds of technologies we have to work with.
I tend to write very, in terms of technology, i.e. the internet, robots, factories, etc. I tend to write very de-technologized futures. I think of technology as being very temporary. I don't think by the time I die, I don't think we're going to have the internet or computers or anything. Yeah, I think it's very unlikely. So in some ways, I'm very like, let's use this thing while we have it, because it's not going to be here for very long. So I mean, I'm not, I feel yeah, you know, there was a few weeks ago, Instagram went down and all these like young people had real crises, and they were all like, oh my God, you know, like sharing. And I really like felt the sincerity in their like rug being pulled from under them of their understanding of like, shit, this is how we can communicate and connect to each other. And this fundamental tool was removed for a number of hours, which is a really long time when you're 18. I remember that feeling. And I wish it was still a really long time and not enough time to get anything done. So for me, I think partly, I guess, being this middle generation where I did grow up with technology, but I also remember when there was no technology. So I guess I'm maybe the oldest person, the youngest person who remembers having no technology. That's right. So I think of it as being very temporary in terms of that form of technology. So I'm very invested in these alternative power sources, as you beautifully put it, Tabita. I did a Tantric training course a few years ago, and Tantric breathwork and breathwork generally has been really a really massive part of my recharging processes, and also just like continuing, surviving, understanding my body, a strange dysphoric body in this world. And one of my Tantra teachers, H, said that literally millions of things have lived and fucked and died on this planet, and every single one of them has left this huge vat of sexual energy, and that is just there all the time, infinitely, and you can just tap into it anytime, whenever you want, and there's you can never take too much. And I was floored by this idea that there was this infinite energy source that I could never take too much of, and that I inherently gave back to in the using of it. I was just like, my mind was blown. And so I think a lot about what are these energy sources, because, you know, it does feel very scarce all the time. It doesn't feel like there's enough time, enough energy, enough hours in the day, you know, like enough of lots of things, enough money. So I think trying to push past that scarcity thinking into other technological realms, other power sources, is really important. And of course, in my science fiction work, I think I'm trying to think about science fictional futures that I've written that are technology heavy. I mean, I try to be very, so like an example of this is because of the Western definition of science fiction, of course, is based around technology, is the idea that it's about technology, whereas fantasy is about magic. It's like a very, very inadequate definition of the difference between fantasy and science fiction. But of course, Octavia Butler classically in Kindred argued that human bodies, and particularly Black bodies, are technologized, are technology, but have also been technologized through the brutal and regimenting legacy of enslavement and colonization, that they were literally transmuted into technology, right? And into not only a labor force, but into a kind of an attempt to really android a people in a really deep, entrenched, metaphysical way. And so she's really flipping this script on what science fiction is. So I think in that way, I think a lot about these bodies as technology. And if pleasure, intimacy, eroticism becomes a recurring pleasure, a recurring theme, a recurring power source, that's what I'm trying to say, a recurring technology in my work. But I also think a lot of with this idea of devolution, which is a problematic term, but one that I'm very kind of, it's a bit like guilty pleasure for me. I'm quite taken with this idea of what that might mean and look like. So in A Shoal of Lovers, the kind of main characters are these descendants of humans that were physiologically altered to essentially inhabit a prey mentality. So they reproduce differently, they eat differently, and they live differently together. And there is this, it was kind of, they were born out of like these last humans who believed that it was because we were predatory, is why we ruin the earth. And if we could like have more of a prey mentality, we were more likely to kind of live in ecologically reciprocal and non-destructive ways. And so this kind of idea of like a voluntary physiological shift and technology being a part of that is something I remain quite disturbingly fascinated with in my speculative work. And you know, there's all kinds of like poly baby making that comes out of that, and I'm interested in and terrified by those kinds of those avenues of physiological shifting. I also fundamentally kind of like reject the idea that changing the body can change who you are or change how happy you are in some kind of way, because the world continues to brand us. I say that as somebody who's attempted to change my body for my entire life, since I was about 9 years old. And yeah, so I think I live with that contradiction, and technology continues to sell all the time the idea that technology can change my body and make it fit. And I reject that, and yet I'm of course captivated by it because it's everywhere all the time, and how could I not be, I suppose. And so I think my art and speculative fiction becomes a way to live with that uncomfortable contradiction. I wrote down the Michelle Murphy term non-innocently entangled, this idea of being complicit in and oppressed by and entangled up in these toxic technologies that are in our body, with the microplastics and the diet pills and the plastic surgery and the everything, but are also kind of destroying us, and also potentially creating future descendants from what we used to call human, which might be something else, which might survive in new and interesting and unexpected ways. And maybe they get to have agency too, and that they're not just products of capitalism, but they are survivors of something. They survived in new and unexpected ways that have agency and potential.
Thanks, Emma. Susan, I don't know if you have some additional questions here, or even if you might have some thoughts on each other's work.
I guess, yeah, Mo, maybe, and Emma and Tabita, I guess I was thinking a lot of the points that Emma's made really, for me, have a strong urban valence, I have to say, and seem really steeped in urban experiences. And I guess, and by all means, Emma, feel free to correct me on that, but because there's a way in which, you know, but my question is simply, I'd really like to hear more about the project of Amakaba and Tabita that you're developing, and the farming practices and the kinds of experiences you're engaged in. And I'm not trying to posit this urban-rural kind of divide, but I think sometimes the sort of when I do hear things about the sort of necessity for greater sort of sensitivity to the ways in which forests and plants are organized, I think that can sometimes be oftentimes a very urban perspective that sees that as a kind of that could conceptualize that as a way to reorganize and our own sense of ethics in relationship to the world in which we habit. But I wonder, certainly, like my own experiences in, in spaces that aren't at all urban, that's just really oftentimes modes of daily existence and practice and things, and so I wonder whether there's any any comments that you'd want to make, Tabita, in relationship to your, I guess it'd be interesting for people who are watching this later as well, just to have a sense of your journey and what brought you to develop this whole project in Amazonia, and also your own your own process of feeling that you need to study perhaps beekeeping or no, that I don't know if you felt the need, but that you're engaged in beekeeping, have gone back to school to study farming, but you mentioned sort of offline that education still is quite organized around increasing yield and productivity, which is the way that most contemporary agricultural colleges work. My father was he worked in soil, and that was, everything was about increasing yield. So anyway, I wonder if those are some prompts that you could respond to or reflect on. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, sure. I think what Amma said earlier about her heartbreaks, and that's what made her, expand on her practices and her passions and her journey. I think I feel very much the same, and in a way, that's what led me to start this farming journey. Because in my work, a lot, everything was about healing. But then in my own life, I felt very broken. So how am I speaking about healing all the time? But then feeling like a mess. So I felt very ungenuine, even though the healing journey is not glamorous, and maybe that was also a lesson in this, that yes, a lot of heartbreaks come along the way, or inner breaks or outer, under, above, side breaks, all of them. And but I really felt the call to the land, like a grounding. So I was also feeling very anxious, and how the art world has this tendency somehow flying you all over, and then suddenly you realize that you've been living for years in hotel rooms, and that I was feeling very isolated and quite sad, to be honest, And then it's even harder when the whole world, some people are, oh, it's amazing, well done, that you're doing great. I'm like, no, I'm not doing great, I'm miserable. But you have that image, of the successful artist, and you have all the points and everything, and you're doing fine. But I guess the ecology or the mechanics of living a life of a successful artist is quite destructive, or it was for me, So then I was like, I can't do this anymore, I need something else. And somehow, yes, the land called, because the land has, in the forest, my father's lineage is from French Guiana. So I moved here 4 years ago, and being called to the forest. And I think to understand that energy, that it's so grounding. It's almost, I want some of this. How can I feel a bit like the forest, really? So, and I think to become something, you have to observe it, and you have to learn it and become it by, creating that intimacy. Really, again, it's and slowly you merge into it. So maybe that's my end goal. I want to become forest-like, unbothered. If a tree fall, at first, when I saw the first tree fall, in my garden, a banana tree, I almost cried. And I was like, no. And I tried to I dig, that seems so ridiculous now, but I dig the hole and I replanted it, and I'm like, no, you can't go. And that's also I think our fear about death, and I think farming if something like that has taught me most, it's the relationship with death, because plant will die, you know. And it's even like there's some form of agriculture, like syntropic agriculture, where you plant trees within your farming system in order to cut them, not to harvest the fruit, but just so that they become food for the soil. So this tree is grown, just you're going to chop it up, and then it's going to go down, decompose, and feed the soil. And I love that, you know, that we're not all here to bear fruits, and you know, you can just live a short life and then be sacrificed in a way, you know, to feed a greater project. And I think that it's so beautiful to me. Like it's yeah. So I love this new journey. I'm learning a lot, and it's also very hard, you know. So I think, as Amma said earlier, that you romanticize the apocalypse. I think I romanticize farming a lot. You know, I'm like, oh yes, I'm gonna be a farmer. I'm gonna, you know, live in the forest. I'm gonna grow my cacao and da da da. But it's hard. It's hard work, like physical work. Also, like the pressure. That, I mean, I go into farming with a lot of privilege that I don't necessarily need to make money out of it, although I want to try, you know, to also like show that farming is a sustainable like practice financially, but I don't have that pressure. So a lot of farmers in French Guiana and all over the world, you know, are like strained like economically, and that's why there's a lot of suicide as well, you know. So that's deep, but I think that's also I don't know, like going into places that are traumatized. Literally, that's what I do, you know. So because that's my own journey, also in my own life, you know, I carry trauma and I'm learning to deal with them, and so as much as I learn to deal with them in myself, it's like, how do we learn collectively to learn with them as a society, but also with the other realms, you know. The land is also traumatized in French Guiana. We don't have time to go into it. So I know in many lands, like all of us, we come from lands that have suffered a lot, that carry the history of what happened on there, but also like the farming practice continue to like rape the earth. That's why we're a culture of rapists, you know. We rape the earth, we rape our women, we rape ourselves, and like it's just abuse that we continue to perpetuate, you know. So until we really learn the art of nurturing our being, of just taking, like not even taking care, like, you know, like holding, like just giving ourselves that what we all crave, like just some rest, some love, I don't know, some slack. Like I don't think we're gonna go anywhere. So, but we're gonna go somewhere. We're all gonna die. That's our only, you know, certitude in life, and maybe that can be beautiful. Who knows?
And feed the soil.
Right, exactly.
And I think we've kind of reached the end of our time that we'd agreed on. I don't know if there are any last questions or thoughts that anybody would like to kind of add in. Anything bubbling out of the surface?
I guess I'm struggling not to respond to this rural urban conversation. I was like,
but yeah, let's. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, because sometimes I'm not saying even specifically you, but then I'm at Goldsmiths, where I know you study, and you know Shella Sheikh very well, I think, and we have a lot of conversations around the more than human, and but so part of it is also like just pragmatic, in some way practically. How do we actually kind of do that? And it seems oftentimes to come from a place that's, when I hear that prompt, it's often and I'm in an urban environment, so you know, so I guess, but I definitely, I always feel troubled by the urban rural dichotomy, and I'm not or so I don't actually, you know what I'm trying to say. It's like,
yeah, I definitely. I mean, I definitely am not a purporter of urban rural kind
no,
of binaries, but I think also, I mean, I can speak for myself that I carry the land with me. I mean, I was born in London, but I was raised between Ghana, and I spent a lot of time in the southwest of England, in Cornwall and Devon and Dorset. And I regularly leave and return to open spaces in order to be able to survive being here. Mm-hmm. But it's also complicated because I'm a Black lesbian woman with a wife in a very white, very homophobic country. And the options of living rurally in this country are very limited, and the options of going home are very limited, particularly right now. I don't know if you're aware of what's happening in Ghana, but it's a really, really hard time. So I haven't been able to go home recently. And so I think there are lots of troubling, there are troubles and privileges around who gets to, and who gets to leave, I suppose, and take that step beyond what we might say is theoretical, right? If we're all sitting around in the room and Goldsmith's talking about microecologies, like this theoretical kind of, I think also romanticizing conversation. And I have at various points left and gone off to kind of work with farmers, but also, one of my closest friends runs a hive 10 minutes away in the middle of London, and she keeps bees right here, and I just finished a residency in a cemetery park, which is a 20-minute cycle from where I am. And we've had lots of conversations about being in this kind of rural space within an urban space, which is a cemetery, we're surrounded by hundreds of years worth of kind of death. And so I think I remain kind of troubled by these kind of conversations and questions around access. I mean, also all my experiences of, not all, but a huge amount of my experiences of being in rural spaces in Ghana are of what might be perceived as idyllic. I mean, I can remember having a conversation with a young guy on a canoe in the middle of the Volta Lake, and it was like beautiful. And he was telling me how he'd made this canoe, and he could like live off the river and the forest around. And I was like, this is amazing. And he was like, but you live in London, and like these are all the reasons why I want to come. And I was like, it's a really bad time to come to London. Like, if you're going to come, I would wait until Brexit dies down. There's lots of racist attacks happening right now and nobody can afford housing. And he was like, this is insane. And so I think these kinds of cross fertilizations, of cross fetishizations that happen from the global north to the global south, working class to middle class to upper class, racialized to non-racialized, we have to be really vocal about them, because also we tiptoe around it all, and it's really problematic. And we have to be, in some ways I have more of a language, I think, because I'm mixed Ghanaian and English, and both my parents fetishize each other. They gain something out of one another's union. And that's a really different narrative to what you might hear from lots of like Black and white unions or working class and middle class unions. And there's all kinds of complex exchanges happening, socially, racially, historically, politically. And I grew up between, in some ways in an all-white family in the middle of nowhere, England, where I was the only Black person in my entire town. I was literally that only kid in the whole school and the whole town. And then also in Hackney, and then also in Ghana, where everybody sees me as white. And, so it's like these not only are these binaries, I think, kind of inadequate, but it's problematic not to engage with the ways that we bring various lands and ecologies with us. And there are ways that we can't return. Mm-hmm. There are ways that we can't go back. Mm-hmm. And that again is heartbreaking and griefful. I grieve deeply for the places that I am from, that I belong to, that I cannot safely live right now.
Right.
And I think I would love to go and live in the middle of Cornwall in a village. But I mean, also, how am I going to survive being in the middle of Cornwall in a village? How am I going to survive? Really, truly, so I think these complexities are, I think, important to remain really like pragmatically and practically in dialogue with, because out of this intersectional discourse are ways that we then are able to go, great, I have this space, come and be in this space, right? Come and be in my house in London. I have friends in Ghana. I'm like, come, let's take some heat off right now. I'll write you a letter of invitation. I'll sponsor your visa application. Come and be here and we'll go to a gay bar, like come and let's do some of that healing for a little bit. And then ways in which I go and I stay with them and I stay with their families in the middle of the Upper Eastern region, and we kind of are able to very, very, inadequately compensate and do some of that kind of healing work, because we're able to speak openly about the fact that these privileges and accesses are far more complicated than some people have them and some people don't. And some people are urban and some people are rural, or are informed by urban or rural discourses and ways of being and seeing the world.
Yeah, I'm working on a project at the moment that you really make me think of, which is actually the first plot of land that was returned to Black people who were forcibly removed off the land under apartheid. And Tabita's actually done a lot of work in sort of nearby area. And it's this interesting kind of site of constantly being removed from the land. So this group of people we initially removed in the 1800s based on another sort of framework of violence, and then were removed again in the 50s, 60s, and then are the first Black community to get their land back. And of course, in South Africa, getting the land back is a big thing. And myself and my collaborator, when we first went there as quite urban humans, were horrified by the lack of any farming or any kind of visible relationship to the soil. And the fact that much of the housing was kind of informal shack settlement. And it messed with all of the kind of pictures and images we have of what it means to return to the land and to get the land back. It's supposed to be, yeah, you're supposed to go back. And as you say, there's some things that are not returnable to. And I think they're quite fascinating in their continuous return and their continuous fight to return to the land. And that return is being done not on the terms that we would suggest are the ideal terms of what it looks like to return to the land, or how we might articulate the meaning of returning to the land as being some kind of connection with the keys in the air, and that's not framed and manifested in kind of the way that we understand it. But they're the ones who keep returning, so they're certainly the ones who have some idea of what that land means, not returning to that person. And it is so easy to kind of make these assumptions of what it means for others, or what the ideal should be. But as you say, there's not necessarily something idyllic or utopic to return to. And Tabita's spoken to like the hardness, the difficulty of that act. And I think it really speaks to, particularly this project really speaks to kind of the work that needs to be done also for all of us in the road that we walk post-COP, in terms of what it means to try and kind of reclaim relationship, to this earth that isn't the incredibly destructive one that we've developed. That it's probably not going to look like what we'd like it to look like, and probably requires a continuous returning. It isn't like a place that we arrive at necessarily. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I like Adrienne Marie Brown's articulation that we need to re-earn our right to be on this planet and to kind of reprove what we are contributing to this ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's really, incredibly kind of relevant way to think it. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I feel like we've come to the end of our discussion. A huge thank you to all of you for being so generous and thoughtful with your work and ideas. So yeah, we'll call it a day.